Hi, Samantha. So excited. Yeah. Always been a big admirer of you, especially since you were one of the founding members of Conjunct Consulting, where you're one of the first few people to say yes to really build out a 1,000-member social change consultancy in Southeast Asia, as well as eventually take over me as the new CEO. And then since then, you grew it to the next level, and then you built out and have a strong development experience across multiple geographies. You have a master's degree in Stanford, lots of amazing things. And I'm excited because, you have a good heart. Two, you're super sharp. Three, you're super hardworking. And four, you are savvy about what needs to change and the judgment required around that. So excited to share your story as you plan out and start on your next adventure. So Sam, for those who don't know you yet, how would you introduce yourself?
Thanks, Jeremy. That's super kind. I'm Samantha, as Jeremy mentioned. So I've really been built out a career in impact. So across consulting, in multiple geographies across like Southeast Asia and Africa. I've also done impact investing, so trying to channel a lot of the funding to companies and startups in emerging markets that I truly believe can help change the world and people's lives for the better. So that's really my background. I recently graduated from Stanford, doing a master's in international policy. And I would say that, a lot of the work that I've done and the work that I continue to do, it's really around channeling the best resources to solving some of the world's biggest problems.
So what was it like mentally?
Sorry, what?
What was it like growing up as Samantha Lee?
What was it like growing up with Samantha Lee? Okay, that's an interesting one. I think for me, it's always been kind of a push and pull with the Singapore culture. So I think in Singapore, that's like a very firm kind of narrative around what success means. So go to a good school, get good grades, come out, be a doctor, lawyer, CEO, tech entrepreneur. That one is a more recent. I think a lot of times like in Singapore, it's really kind of like a very set path as a highly skilled professional. So I think for me, like I've always kind of struggled against the narrative. I always feel like I'm going to be spending 40, 50, 60 hours a week doing something. I really wanted to be fulfilling for myself, but also to try and, do good for the world. And I think I got a lot of good exposure to that. So I've always volunteered. I've always met a lot of really great social sector leaders who kind of mentored me along the way. So I think that's always been kind of an interesting journey because like I had like pushback from my parents too, who are like, why are you doing this? Why are you volunteering so much? They obviously saw a lot of benefit in terms of character development. But at the same time, they're like, you need to study harder and you need to like figure out what you want to do in your life. So I think it was interesting when I went to the US for the first time and lived there for the first time. And I remember this one open session with Delberg, and the way they talked about their projects and the way they talked about the work that they were doing and just the amazing company that is. I was like, wow, all of these things that I had considered a pastime and hobby before can actually be a career. And that really kickstarted my interest and kind of my path down development consulting.
And I remember when I first met you, you were just starting out and just having that same interest of what you just mentioned of development consulting. What was it like joining Conjunct Consulting in the early days? I don't know what you remember about me, but what was those early days like?
Yeah, so I think for me, it was trying to figure out what I wanted my career as an undergraduate to be. So I always knew that I had a heart for the social sector, and I think for me it was about how can I marry that with learning some skills as well as building something new. So I think I've always had it in me to like to build new things. So even before college, I was working with a nonprofit actually called Youth Business International. The Singapore chapter is called Youth Business Singapore. And so the two things I did there was to really launch a volunteering portal that will allow teenagers and youth in Singapore to be able to clock in hours that you give in volunteering to a youth bank. So that was great. I helped to launch that. And so when I was like going to college, I was also thinking a lot about, oh, is there something new and exciting that I could join and be a part of? And so Conjunct came my way. I remember kind of like hearing you and Jiachuan pitch at NUS, and I remember thinking, wow, this is actually a really good model. I really enjoyed that. I get to get mentored, I get to work with actual nonprofits and other social sector leaders. I get to give my time and skills for good. So I really like the model, and I really like the fact that you guys are just starting out. So it really made me feel like, I could be part of the building process as well.
And what do you remember of those first few years of, like you said, the mentorship and working with the social sector clients?
Yeah, I remember the first client meeting we had. This was with Bisling, right? And they help persons with disabilities be able to get training and eventually employment opportunities. And I remember being so nervous that and wanting so much for them to like me that I brought pineapple tarts because this was around Chinese New Year. So I came with my pineapple tarts and I sat down, and their first question to me was, "You are really young. How can you help us?" And I remember thinking, wow, Jeremy just threw me to the sharks. What is this? I was not well prepped for this. Um, no, but I also remember kind of like just telling them very humbly and said, yeah, I don't have your level of experience. And obviously, you've been doing this work for so much longer, and there's no way I will be able to value add that way. But, we're extra manpower. We're happy to do the research that I know nonprofits never really have the time or bandwidth to do. We're a fresh perspective. And, I really like the vision. I really like the vision of this thing and helping persons with disabilities be included in society to be able to find meaningful employment. They will also then be able to give them the independence and dignity that they all deserve. So that's why I said, I was like, I like your vision and I'm willing to do a lot to help you bring that about. And I think that was somewhat convincing because they obviously worked with us and continued working with us throughout the years.
Yes, I mean they were a very happy client for multiple project and engagement. So you definitely did not, fail if that's what you're saying. And I think you definitely more than succeeded based on the fact they kept coming back over and over again. One interesting thing is that obviously there you are, and you mentioned a couple of things, which is that you're learning, you're starting out, and obviously I remember that you went through multiple engagements in different roles. What do you think you learned from that period of time when you were getting and doing this project, but also really being, I guess, that at a time a junior member of the Conjunct Consulting community and team?
I think the biggest thing I learned was how to learn. And I think this is something that like all consultants learn, which is that you need to go into a new industry or a new project or a new subject area and be able to pick it up really quickly. And also that's the number one thing that I learned is just how to learn, how to gain gain information and also be able to distill how the information could be useful to your client. I think the second thing I learned is really around kind of how to be a good listener. So consulting is really just about providing value. A lot of work in general is about providing value if you want to be a good person. And so being able to listen and lean into kind of what the problems that your client is facing. And a lot of times it sometimes feels like a counseling session almost, but that isn't, and that's where the empathy comes in. And that's where you both have to listen out for the emotions behind it, but also strategically how you best leverage this project to be able to help your client solve a problem. So I think those two things at the early stages are things that were really crucial and two skills that I still take with me to today.
And one interesting thing, of course, is that there you were, and I remember that you eventually spent a stint in the civil service. So you want to share a little bit about what you were thinking as you explored that route? Yeah.
Yeah, no, my dream as a teenager was really to join the civil service, get a scholarship, go to Oxford, do PPA, and then come back and be a high flying diplomat. So I think my foray into like civil service, was an offshoot of two things. So I had done like an internship with the World Trade Organization that was part of the Singapore government and delegation, and I really enjoyed that. And I think the my boss then as an intern basically came back and was like, oh, now that you're graduating, would you want to come work with us? And so she really kind of helped set that up. So I think for me it was just kind of like exploring and seeing whether or not government, because I had that dream for so long, right? Whether or not government would still make sense for me. I still really enjoyed the fact that I got to work at an international organization and at such like a high level, working across different countries. There was also a development angle. I was working on like least developed countries issues. I was working on trade facilitation, environmental goods. So there was like a little bit of alignment. So yeah, and I think it just felt like a safe route as well. Like I mentioned before, like my parents were like, civil service is great. Iron Rice Bowl is great. So they were not happy when I left. But yeah, so that's kind of my why I decided to join them, and it was a great experience. I still think that like there were no push factors. There were only really pull factors, which is really kind of coming over to run conjunct. But yeah, I still highly recommend it as an organization. I really enjoyed my time in the Ministry of Trade and Industry in doing that. Yeah.
So that's where our stories obviously continued to be in parallel. So I had been watching you grow as a consultant and as a leader, and I had a whole series. I think we had over 100 folks, turn up and apply to be the next CEO of Conjunct Consulting. And I did remember asking you and saying, like, I think you have a solid shot, right? And encouraging you to throw your hat into the ring. What do you remember about that process? Because there's two conversations, right? One is whether it's an organization, yet it's also a different role, right? In an executive role. And of course, secondly, at a time you also had a choice to also continue being in the Singapore civil service, right?
Mm.
So what was that decision making there at that time?
Yeah, so I think for me, honestly, you didn't tell me that there were so many people applying. So I think I feel like if you had told me that I may not have applied, just been intimidated. Like bear in mind that I was also like 23, 24 at this stage, right? So to me, like the thought process was actually really simple. It was like, A, do I believe in the work? B, do I believe that I can contribute to the work? And three, do I think that this is the right time to do this? And so for me, like in terms of the first one, do I believe in the work? So the nice part having come through the organization and been there from the start was that I could see the way that the organization had an impact on everybody that it touched. So from the individual consultants to the nonprofit leaders and social entrepreneurs to like the mentors to government bodies that we worked with, I think that we were really creating something very special. Essentially we were creating the market for like skills-based volunteering. There was like that didn't exist before. Like now it's everyone sees it as a common thing in Singapore, and there's been a bunch of organizations that's come up since then. But 10 years ago, like no one was doing it. No one thought it'd be possible to make professionals who are already working 40, 50, 60 hours a week give it more time doing work that's very similar to the work that they're already doing. So I think I really kind of enjoyed that, and I really believed in what Conjunct was doing in terms of bringing skilled talent and helping social sector leaders through that. I think the other thing also is just whether or not I felt I could contribute. And I think throughout my experience at Conjunct, helping to grow it as well, was I just felt like there were things I wanted to bring to the table, and there were ways in which I wanted to grow Conjunct. So like not just in terms of like scaling and growth, but also ensuring that the students continue to see how this ties into a potential career, continue to show how they can be high impact socially conscious leaders, and how they can take their learnings and take it with them throughout their careers and do something good with it. So I think I had a certain vision to how I wanted to grow Conjunct as well, and how I could bring that about. And then last thing in terms of timing, honestly, that was the hardest one because, and I think everybody who kind of wants to be a social entrepreneur or take a leadership role in the social sector kind of always goes through that debate. Like, do I first grow some professional skills like in consulting or operations or whatever, and then after that make that jump and take that corporate experience to the social sector, or do I join it early on? So I think for me that was a big debate as well. But I also felt like, I was young and I had a lot of energy, still have a lot of energy, and more experience now, so that's kind of nice. But yeah, so I was young, I had a lot of energy, and I felt I could take bigger risk, and so I did. So I just felt like timing wise, it worked out really well too.
And one interesting dynamic about all of that was that you came in and the board was reviewing and screening and making decisions, and I was observing. I think one interesting part, and it came into it was, and I remember you saying was that I think you were very frank that at a time versus other candidates, that there were things that you wanted to learn as well, and you would continue learning. Um, versus other folks who just more experienced in different domains, either in consultancy directly or in the social sector as well. So from that perspective, I guess you went on to take over from me. I went off on a nice long hike without the internet after that, and did some silent meditation without devices. And there you were, just going and taking over. And what was that like? Do you remember? And like, there you are, you've been running this job, preparing, getting the offer and then choosing to take it on. So tell us more about what that was like.
Honestly, and I think this is a nice part about being young, which is like you take everything with such fearlessness because you don't know how hard it would be. So when I first took it on, I was just like, okay, great. I got this job. I love this organization. I have all these plans. I'm just gonna like hit the ground running and execute. So I think when I first took over, that was kind of like my mindset going in, and that's pretty much what I did. But as like obviously as like the organization continued to grow, and then we obviously hit some financial difficulties as well. And then it became more about, okay, how can I grow this organization into something that's financially sustainable, that's going to be around for the next like 10, 20, 100 years. And that really shifted my mindset. um, I tell people that my experience with Conjunct is really like being thrown into the deep end and learning how to swim before you drown, and it really was that. But I also think that it was a master class in two things: in leadership and in sales. So I think what people don't realize is that like working with volunteers and working with people who you don't pay and have no obligation to you, it's really is a master class in leadership, because you continuously have to make sure that like they believe in the vision, that the organization is well run, that they come in and fulfill, and that they get the structure and the support so that they can produce their best work with the amount of time and resources that they have, and how to just continue to keep them engaged and accountable and motivated. And so all of that was really a great learning experience. And I think that it really helped me grow as a leader, because so many times you can't use the same things that a lot of like corporate people can, right? In terms of like, oh, bonus structure or or financial incentives or things like that. You don't have that. So it's really about coming to the core of the mission and the vision, and just understanding people and why they're doing what they're doing, and how to put them in the best place possible, so that the strengths can really shine and they can find fulfillment. So that was a masterclass in leadership. I think the second thing, it's really around kind of like a masterclass in sales. Like what people don't realize is that one of the hardest things to sell in the world is selling something that people are used to getting for free. And because we had started out as such a nonprofit where we're raising grant money and giving our projects for free, like moving that towards a more social enterprise, financially sustainable place where we're starting to charge a cost recovery fee, like there was a lot of like process involved in terms of like, okay, now I have to sell this thing to nonprofits, don't have some of them don't have a lot of money, and now I have to make that I have to sell in a way that they will see value and that they will actually get value out of it. So I think that was also really kind of like when I talked earlier about how like I really leaned into like listening to what are some of the challenges and the problems that these social sector leaders had. It's really also around then tying that to the value that I could bring and how I could improve these projects and really like grow out a product and service line that was able to really meet their needs in a way that's so powerful that they would be willing to pay for it. So I think that's also a second thing. I think selling to corporates when we started a corporate engagement arm was also like truly powerful, because now like so there's a nonprofit side of it, but the other thing that's also really hard to sell in the world is selling to a company when they not only think they can do it for free and themselves, but also they're giving their time and the effort of their employees to work that has nothing to do with the company. So and so we're saying like not only should you lend us your employees for a certain number of hours in a week or over a couple of months to work with these like nonprofit leaders and social entrepreneurs, you also have to pay us for it. So that was a masterclass in sales. And I think it's really the same thing as well, figuring out what is it that companies need, what do they want, and how can these projects really fulfill a need for them. Yeah.
And what did you learn about yourself in that, as you kind of like surmounted these different, challenges while I was off hiking? And
Yes, I remember that.
what did you learn about yourself along the way?
That's a great question. I learned to not be afraid to do things that I've never done before. I think that's actually a really powerful one. I learned that I was resourceful enough and could learn quickly enough to be able to deliver in something, even if it's something that's like relatively new to me and relatively something that I didn't have a lot of experience in. I also learned about the power in having a community. So part of the reason why I can do all of that is also because I had good people who were on my side, who were willing to step up and help, and really willing to give their talents and resources. So I think the power of community and building that movement and building that group of people who, or the tribe of people almost, and that village to raise a child and a social enterprise, and how powerful that can be. And that's truly how anything gets done. So Yeah, so I definitely learned an ability to galvanize and rally and just the importance of people.
And there you are, obviously building all of that. And there's a where you're building, you're building, you're building. And what would you say are some myths and misconceptions, I would say, about, the Singapore social sector, and all the adjacent, interactions and partnerships that are associated with that?
So not even the Singapore social sector. I think the social sector as a whole gets a lot of misconceptions. So one of the very big ones is that like the social sector is the least innovative of the three sectors. So I think everyone always assumes that the private sector is the most innovative, moves super fast. Like, they always say like move fast and break things. And then after the public sector, especially in Singapore, the public sector is usually seen very well and seen as like probably more innovative than a lot of governments out there. And then the social sector is kind of like the younger brother who's kind of like always lagging behind and always very bureaucratic and always trying and short of resources. So I think a lot of people have this impression that the social sector as a whole isn't as innovative and it's kind of like always backward and stuck, right? But I think something that I've seen and cuts across both in Singapore as well as in the community I've seen in like Myanmar or Vietnam or Cambodia or Nigeria, it's really that people when they are in adversity and in difficult situations actually are able to use the little resources that they have to come up with really innovative solutions. So for example, like I was in Myanmar and there's this like big group of farmers. So Myanmar has one of the highest numbers of smallholder farmers, which means that they have less than like an acre of land. And so what happens there is that because they don't really need and they don't have the resources to buy, like say a tractor or inputs, etc., what they do is that they have like a rotating shed system, and this is something that they were able to work out. So they'll come together, pull money, and then just rent a tractor from a neighboring village. And so that's something that was like truly remarkable. They were able to work out like cycles of who grows what crops at what time so that everybody can earn enough, because different crop cycles have different kinds of price points. So there's a lot of innovation that happens, especially so more so in cultures and communities and areas that have less resources because they're forced to be more innovative, they're forced to be more resourceful. And I think that's something that like a lot of companies and even the public and private sector can learn from. I think the second misconception that happens a lot is that you can't grow a company that's both financially successful and do good. I think a lot of people still have in their heads that there's a consistent trade off, that you always have the trade off profits and revenue for the sake of the greater good if you want to do both. And I don't think that's the case. We've seen a lot of really great examples of that, Zipline being one of them. So you never heard of Sublime. Sublime is a great company that uses autonomous drones to deliver medical devices, blood, vaccinations, etc., to rural areas. They started out in Rwanda and Ghana, and then obviously they expanded in Africa and expanding to the US. So they are a huge company now. They raised like $250 million. They're valued at $2.75 billion. So like definitely comparable to any other kind of like private startup out there that's commercially based. So I think more and more we're starting to see examples like that. There's still far and few between, and I think part of me wanting to do more work in this space is to be able to grow more companies like that, so it becomes much more of a norm than say exceptional examples.
And one interesting aspect of it, of course, is that you've always had this interesting aperture between what I call the Singapore social sector and the international development lens, which is, I think the same set of issues, but really at really different geographies, right? And so you eventually wrapped up successfully, handed over, and you went off to build out that international development expertise as a consultant and in impact investing. So talk to us about what you learned in this new leg of the journey.
Yeah, so when I left Conjunct, I still very much believed in the organization, and I think I just had built a team where I felt I could feel confident handing it over. So to me, when I left, it was really for two reasons. One was to be able to, like you said, get more experience in developing countries, and two, be able to explore social financing. So I think something that came out during my time at Conjunct and all my work in the nonprofit sector was really the idea that money is really hard to raise. It's really hard to find funding for truly innovative things. And I really wanted to kind of delve deeper into that problem and to take a step at seeing how other people have been solving it. So I joined Elevated Social Businesses, which used to be part of the Clinton Foundation, and they split out. And I was helping them expand to Southeast Asia, doing agriculture investments. I loved it. So I basically spent like 1 week in Singapore, 1 week in either Myanmar, Vietnam, or Cambodia. And I think that was really kind of like, once again, being dropped off into the deep end. I was alone a lot of times. We had to hire our own drivers who were also our interpreters, and we were out in this like rural areas. Woke up at 6 a.m. in the morning with the sunrise. At the same time, the farmers woke up. Went down, spoke to them, interviewed them, and then on the other side, talk to buyers because we're doing a lot of contract farming. So yeah, it was really a remarkable experience. I really got to understand kind of the challenges of working in a developing economy. So a lot of things that we take for granted in Singapore. So like a transparent regulatory system, things like having easy lending, things like that don't really exist in quite the same way in a lot of these countries, especially out in the rural areas. So I think for me, just being able to see that in a very tangible way was very eye opening. I think the other part of it is also to be able to get inspired as well by the people that I met. So I met a farmer that was growing long beans, and and I guess because it's me and I ask weird questions, I was like, oh, so are you happy doing this? And he was like, yeah. So even though I don't earn a lot of money, I am glad that I can make a living out of doing something that makes me happy. And I was like, wow, like, isn't that what all of us just really want to do? Isn't that like the dream? And the fact that like this farmer who's not making very much, out in the rural areas in Myanmar can feel the same way too, and feel the way that a lot of us want to feel about our work is remarkable. And I think that continues to inspire me to want to ensure and build like an ecosystem around how can we help these people be able to continue to do that and make a better living out of that as well.
And one interesting aspect about all of that is that you're building all this expertise and dynamics, and you decide to go do a master's at Stanford. So what?
Yeah, so I think so I was able to do that, and then after that, I was also helping Kevin at Trisector Associates be able to structure social impact bonds because I wanted to see how I guess a different funding mechanism that's performance based, outcome oriented, also tied in both private donors and investors as well as government funding. So I think that kind of gave me an introduction and a little bit more like in-depth knowledge and first-hand experience kind of structuring these deals and also evaluating investment opportunities. And then for me, the question is always, do I want to start my own thing? Do I want to join something? What do I want to do with all of this like experiences that I was getting? And I think for me, um, at that point in time, I had decided that, okay, the budgeting of the idea was starting to come to me about kind of raising a fund, right? Like, how can I raise a fund to be able to grow companies that can do well by doing good? And so this one had like a genesis story, kind of like a like spark moment almost. So I was actually talking to Jun Kiet from Ojoy, who runs basically a nonprofit and social enterprise that provides some care services for the elderly. And so obviously the aging population is a big issue in Singapore. By 2030, 1 in 4 Singaporeans are going to be over the age of 65, which is crazy. So I was like talking to him, just catching up with him, and he was like, "Oh, I have this great vision. Like, I really want to be able to build smart homes for the elderly. Like everything fully integrated. I'll have like a we program that will help them do their like daily exercises. I'll have like a telehealth system set up so that they can have like the consultations from home. I will have like medications delivered to their door. I have like lights and sound systems that can be like voice automated, like all of it, like everything. This is like state of the class, like just like future of like aging at home. Like truly, like it was remarkable. And so I was like, wow, this sounds really great. Like, like, what are you going to do? What are you doing to make it happen? And he's like, oh, yeah, I put together a plan, a proposal. I already found like tech providers to do this. I'm just trying to raise funding from like, to get this going and build a pilot together. And I was like, okay, great. Then, like, how's it going? And he's like, very hard to raise funding because, like, if I go to like a government agency that's typically in social services, they'll tell me, oh, but this is a tech company they're trying to build. Why don't you go to like IMDA or something? And he's like, oh, but if I go to IMDA or like a tech office, and they're like, oh, but you're serving a group of beneficiaries. Why don't you go to like MSF or another like community related organization? So he's like, it's very hard. And so I was just like, no, I get that. I think it's hard to navigate the government system. I think that's always generally the case, especially if you cross like different sectors. And so I was like, okay, how much money do you need really to like just get a pilot off the ground, like minimum amount of money? And he was like, he thought about it for a while and he was like, 50K. And I was like, you know what? I have 50K. Like I have 50K that I'm not really doing very much with, like it's part of my savings, but like I'm not doing anything with it. So like I can give you an interest-free loan for 50K. And he's like, wow, I didn't know you believed in us this much. So I was like, yeah, I mean, I buy into the vision. I worked with you before. I know that you can do this. And I was like, yeah, I'm willing to do this. So in the end, he was like, and I was like, I'm willing to help you do it too. I can be like, have you be like a part-time employee just to help you grow this out. And he's like, okay, okay. It's like, let me think about it. He was like, I'm still talking to a couple of funders, and I'll see what happens. So in the end, he was able to raise funding, a couple hundred grand to be able to get Pal off the ground, and he didn't need my 50K. But that really got me going, and I was just like, like I only have so many 50Ks, but if I could raise money from other people who want to do the same, like I can really take my 50K and scale that up like 100 times, 1,000 times, 1,000,000 times, right? And so that's how the idea of building a fund came about. And I think that was something that happened 3 years ago. And by the point in time, I felt like I wasn't ready. Right, I wasn't ready. I was like, a lot of my experience was still Singapore, still Southeast Asia, and I feel like if I wanted to do this, I wanted to be truly global. So that's why I went to grad school. So that's why I decided, you know what, I also want to learn from the best. And so I was like, where in the world has the best practices in terms of like impact investing, in terms of like philanthropy, in terms of like helping to build great companies? And I was like, okay, the US. So I applied to Stanford, got very lucky. They offered me a full ride, which was nice. And yeah, 2 years later, I'm here, and the rest is history.
What did you learn from Stanford?
A lot. Um, Also, I think part of it was just also COVID. So I also learned a lot from the COVID experience. Um, I think three main things I learned at Stanford. One is to have a bias towards action. So I picked Stanford also. I picked a bunch of different like grad schools, but I also was very clear that I wanted to do. I will only apply to grad schools that had both a really good policy program and a really good business program. So that I was able to attend classes in both schools, basically. So Stanford obviously had both of that. So I took a lot of classes across both my international policy masters as well as in the graduate school of business. So one thing I learned a lot in the GSB was really this bias towards action. So they always say like, you can have the best laid plans, but we're waiting for like the 100%, the perfect idea, the perfect plan. You've waited too long. So I think for like there's a big culture of like, you know what, you have an idea, you don't know if it's great, you don't know if it's bad, just start it. Because the only way to know and to find out is to do it. The only way to know if you can do something is to do it. So I think that was like a big part of the journey of my experience at Stanford. It's just like the bias with action. I think the second thing as well is just like same thing which I learned, like just reinforce the idea that I learned in Conjunct, which is that like people is everything. So having really good mentors, having really good like advisors, having really good friends who can help you like really refine your idea and think through things was really powerful and useful. So being able to surround yourself by like really smart, really dedicated, really passionate people. Same thing. It's still kind of like it's the be all and end all. I think lastly is just really kind of being able to stay true to who I am. And I think being in school and being in grad school is like you get pulled in all sorts of directions. So there's a lot of things to explore. You're like, oh, fintech's really great. Or like, oh, like this is a new thing. Like tech is really interesting. Crypto is really interesting. Like AI is really like wonderful to think about. So there's like so many different routes you could go down. And everybody has like an interesting idea all the time. But I think I went in with a very clear idea on what I wanted to get out of it. I wanted to hope to build through my experience, and I came out of it still very much believing in that. And I think that actually gave me even more conviction because I also told myself like, okay, I'm going to give myself 2 years to go out and really look at every single organization that's tangentially related to what I want to do. And I feel like it's kind of funny because I always said that like even though I work with a lot of founders, like, I never really considered being an entrepreneur myself because I think if there's an organization that exists that really kind of wants to do what I want to do, then it makes more sense for me to just lend my support and effort and energy to that organization and help that grow. So I was like, okay, I'm gonna just spend my 2 years looking for that organization. And I think I found a lot of really great organizations. Like there's a lot of wonderful firms doing a lot of really great work. But 2 years later, and talking to hundreds of different investors and hundreds of different organizations in this area, I still haven't really found something that truly aligns with what I want to do and how I want to do it. And so 2 years later, I still think that, this is something that I want to build.
Right. And the problem with targeting is really what you mentioned earlier is like really that impact funding and the dynamics associated with that. So, what is the problem? I mean, you said the government has been funding. There was a lot of hype about social impact bonds, and so far, I think we've seen some traction, but not to the magnitude I think people were hoping. So, what's the problem from your perspective?
Yeah, so
Set of
let's zoom out
problems.
a little bit and talk about the problem with funding first, right? So the UN estimates that there is a $2.5 trillion financing gap every year in meeting the SDGs. But if you do meet the SDGs, that opens up $12.5 trillion in market opportunities. So the question is, why is there still, even though there's all these activity going on, there's a lot of philanthropy, there's a lot of impact investing, why is there still a $2.5 trillion gap? And the reason is that because it's hard. It's hard to raise funding. Philanthropy can only go so far. And as long as the funding remains very much a one-way flow, which means that it never gets recycled, it never ever comes back, it never ever grows the same way, then we'll always have that gap. So if you talk to impact investors, and impact investing is still a relatively small portion of obviously all of the development aid money as well as like all the money, it's still a relatively small portion. And so I was like, okay, if there isn't enough money, where is all the money in the world going to? And the answer to that is really private investments, right? There is $70 trillion of private investments. There is about $300 billion of that went into venture capital in a single year alone in 2020. And $300 billion is, for perspective, twice the amount of total global ODA, which is international aid, going to developing countries. So if you think about scale and just where the funding is going in the world, obviously they're going to private companies and obviously they're going to private startups. So then the question is, how can I channel some of that money towards companies that are also doing good? So I think to me, the problem comes from that, right? The problem that like funding is very much for development is still a very small portion of global money. The fact that like people care deeply about financial returns and don't believe that companies that do good can bring those returns. And I think lastly is just really kind of like, and it's true, it is hard, right? And also there aren't a lot of companies that can do that. They can do well financially and also do good socially. So those three factors, like we talked to impact investors to say, I would love to give out more funding, but there just isn't pipeline. And you talk to like companies that are trying to do that, they're like, I would love to be able to grow my organization, but I don't have enough funding. And then you're like, wait, if one side has a lot of money and the other side needs more money, why isn't there a match? Why isn't this problem solved yet? And the answer is that because they really fundamentally look for slightly different things, right? The organization needs a lot of patient capital, a longer time, the right support to grow. But the impact investors obviously need to have a certain threshold of growth before they can invest. So a little bit of a chicken and egg. So I think that's also kind of why that problem hasn't been solved.
So why didn't something, social impact bonds solve the problem?
So I think social impact bonds definitely is contributing to the solution. I think there is definitely a place for social impact bonds that will continue to have a place. I think the goal of social impact bonds is really more around government efficiency. So what I see as the greatest value of social impact bonds is really helping governments be more efficient in their government spending, which is really important if your government doesn't have a big budget to begin with. But as a structure, it's not very well suited to help companies grow, especially if the company is structured as a private entity. A social impact bond takes typically 2 years or more to structure. And like, as you know, in the startup scene, like if you're a small company, you can't wait 2 years of funding to come in. You really just need the funding and you will grow quickly. A big part of the social impact bonds is also that there is a rigorous evaluation component to it, because a lot of it is around trying to find effective solutions. So that also means that the program actually needs to remain fairly consistent throughout the evaluation period. But versus in a startup, like everything's changing. In 6 months' time, your company could look very different from like the 6 months before. So I think in because of those different components, it's not as well suited to helping to grow like a high growth company that wants to grow really quickly and scale really quickly while also doing good.
Great. Thanks for the very quick summary about The fact that social impact bonds are useful is just that they are limited in the scope versus the huge requirements that are needed to hit our UN SDG goals. So, could you tell us about a time that you have been brave?
Oof, yeah. Um, so I talked about how like 3 years ago I had this idea of starting a fund and wanting to invest in and help founders who want to build companies that do well by doing good. So 3 years ago, I didn't feel ready. Today, I've launched a company and I still don't feel ready. And I think it took a long time for me to get to this place. I think if you grow up as a Singaporean, where you're in a very risk averse culture, the fear of failure on one side, it's always going to be something at the back of your mind. And so I think there was a lot of hesitation there, like, oh, what if I do this? And why want to do it so big that like, it's so likely that I could fail. And so there was a lot of fear associated with that comes to just kind of growing up in the culture that we grew up in. But on the other hand as well, like counterbalancing that was the fear of regret, right? Just that like if I never try this, like and 20 years down the road, 30 years down the road, like will I regret not having tried? Will I regret not having done it? So I was like battling between the two fears, and this is a weird thing I do when I get overwhelmed is to lie in the middle of my living room on my rug. Also because I just moved to this apartment 2 weeks ago, and my coffee table is taking another month to arrive. So so I was just lying on my rug and staring at the ceiling and just kind of processing my feelings and just being like, why do I feel so afraid? Yeah, and then it just slowly kind of like as I processed it came to me that like because I'm stuck between two opposing fears, like the fear of failure and the fear of regret, and I felt like I couldn't move forward, and I didn't want to apply for another job. And then eventually for me like the fear of regret won out because I realized that it's not about me, right? It's about all of these like really wonderful founders who I met along the way who has used like amazing visions of how they can make the world better. And it's all about the people who I met along the journey, the farmers in Myanmar, the patients in Nigeria with chronic conditions, yet still manage to turn the condition around and see it as a positive way to be able to make sure that they live a healthier life, make sure that they are exercising and eating right, and they still have so much energy, and like just the ability to see people who turn adversity into opportunity has been so powerful and so inspiring in my life that like if I can do this thing and I'm able to help them do more of that and to help these people in these communities to lead better lives and help these founders be able to achieve their vision, I think that it would totally be worth it. So yeah, I picked myself off the ground literally and started building a website, and here we are. So yeah, that was my brave moment because it was not easy.
Amazing, Samantha. Thank you so much for sharing all of that. So I'd love to wrap things up here by really paraphrasing the three big themes that I got away from your sharing. The first is thank you so much for, I think, really sharing about the things you've learned along your professional journey. I think the way you defined it as master classes at one point, around leadership, around sales, and also I think what you learned along the way and consultant in the civil service, as CEO of Conjunct Consulting, as an international development consultant, and where you are now. So I think a lot of learnings along the way that has been really amazing. And the second, of course, is I think the articulation from a domain expertise of around the $2.5 trillion impact funding gap between today and the UN Sustainable Development Goal unlocks another $12.5 trillion of opportunity and upside. And how you see past solutions versus what are the upcoming requirements of which you have decided to tackle in your own way now. And lastly, thank you for sharing what I call the bias towards exhibited at every stage. And I really love how you were self-aware about how you felt about things, the different trade-offs at each stage, and how you eventually made a decision to push forward at each stage of your career, ranging from exploring your passion for impact all the way to taking on the leadership role, as you mentioned, of being taking over, all the way to what you learned at Stanford and pushing forward with being a founder of Stonesoup Partners. So, Samantha, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks very much, Jeremy, for having me. It was really great kind of speaking with you. I was super excited to be here, and I'm really glad I did this. So yeah, so thanks for giving me the opportunity, and I Hope to see you around soon.